Jake Mitchell had always embraced a simple yet profound philosophy: live and let live. His farm, a sprawling expanse of land that had been passed down through generations, was more than just a livelihood. It was a legacy. The steady rhythm of life on the farm, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the fields, the earthy scent of fresh soil, and the tranquil sounds of his animals, was enough to give Jake all the peace he ever needed. This peaceful existence was about to be shattered by an unexpected force: Karen Whitmore. Karen had arrived in Crestwood Estates 5 years earlier as the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She was the kind of person who thought every detail of life should fit into a rigid framework of rules and order. A woman with an overinflated sense of authority, Karen was obsessive about maintaining a picture-perfect vision of the world around her. She'd earned a reputation for enforcing rules that no one remembered voting on. But despite her authority within the suburban development, she had always kept to her own neighborhood, until now. Karen had set her sights on Jake's farm. Jake had watched the developments unfold in the neighboring community with mild curiosity, but when Karen marched up his driveway, clipboard in hand, that curiosity turned to suspicion. He'd been enjoying his morning coffee, basking in the peace of his farm when Karen appeared, dressed in a perfectly pressed beige pantsuit and wearing a smile that could freeze water. "Mr. Mitchell?" Her tone was sharp and professional, as if she were about to offer him a deal he couldn't refuse. Jake raised an eyebrow, slowly sipping his coffee. "That's me. I'm Karen Whitmore," she continued, her smile tightening into something that didn't quite reach her eyes. "President of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association. I'd like to have a chat about your property." Jake set down his mug and leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Didn't know my farm had anything to do with Crestwood Estates?" Karen's smile didn't falter. "Technically it doesn't, but your farm borders our community, and as I'm sure you understand, property values are a very delicate matter." Jake's amusement began to wane, but he didn't interrupt. He watched her with interest. "We've received multiple complaints," she continued, "about your operations, the noise, the smell, the visual impact on the neighborhood. We maintain a certain aesthetic in Crestwood Estates, and we believe your farm would benefit from some adjustments." Jake gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Adjustments?" "Yes," Karen replied, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "For starters, that large red barn is quite an eyesore. Perhaps you could repaint it to something more neutral, or better yet, downsize it. And there's also the matter of the rooster. Some of our residents have mentioned being woken up before sunrise. It's disruptive." Jake leaned forward, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "So, let me get this straight. You want me to repaint my barn and somehow convince my rooster to hit the snooze button just because some of your residents don't like the sound of the countryside?" Karen's smile remained, but her eyes flashed with impatience. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand change can be difficult, but this is really in everyone's best interest. I'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue." Jake stood up, stretching his arms. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate you stopping by, but my farm isn't part of your HOA. I don't answer to your rules, and as far as I can tell, my land, my barn, and my animals aren't hurting anyone." Karen's expression tightened, and she turned on her heel, her clipped words trailing behind her. "We'll see about that." Jake watched her march away, shaking his head in disbelief. He had dealt with stubborn animals before, but something told him Karen was going to be a different kind of problem. Little did he know, the peaceful rhythm of his life was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't have imagined. Jake had dealt with his fair share of challenges over the years: harsh winters, unpredictable droughts, and the occasional farm accident. But none had been quite like Karen Whitmore. The first few days after their encounter, he thought she might just be a passing annoyance, like a storm that ruffled the leaves but eventually blew away. He couldn't have been more wrong. It all started with the letters. The first one arrived in his mailbox with the official Crestwood Estates HOA logo, stamped boldly at the top like some sort of official decree. Jake had laughed when he saw it, thinking it was just another one of Karen's idle threats. He opened the letter, which outlined a long list of alleged violations his farm was committing. Most of it was absurd: Complaints about the red barn's color, the unpleasant smell of farm life, and the roosters crowing, disturbing the peace of Crestwood Estates. Jake could hardly contain his amusement as he read through the document. The letter demanded that he cease and desist all non-compliant activities within 7 days or face legal action. Jake just shook his head. This is insane, he thought. His farm was well within county regulations and agricultural zoning laws. The HOA had no authority over him, yet here they were, sending him threats like they owned the land. He tacked the letter to his fridge as a trophy, a reminder of Karen's audacity, and went about his day. But that was just the beginning. A week later, a series of county officials arrived at Jake's farm, a health department inspector, a zoning commission officer, and even an animal welfare agent. Each one of them had received a complaint, filed by none other than Karen, about supposed violations. They all arrived with clipboards in hand, expressions of disapproval already etched on their faces. Jake didn't panic. He knew his farm was in perfect compliance with every rule. What he hadn't expected was the sheer persistence of Karen's vendetta. Roger, the health department official, was the first to speak as he surveyed Jake's immaculate animal pens. "Son, I don't know who you pissed off," he said with a tired sigh, "but they've got us running circles. This is the cleanest farm I've seen in months." Jake chuckled. "I have an idea who it might be." Roger shot him a knowing look and grumbled under his breath. "Off the record?" "Yeah, her name's on every complaint we've gotten. She's a real piece of work." Jake watched Roger leave, still shaking his head. He'd never expected a woman like Karen to stir up so much trouble. But as the days passed, more inspectors and officials showed up, and each time they left, it was with the same bewildered expressions. Everything was in order. There were no violations. There was nothing wrong. But Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Soon after the county visits, Jake started finding more letters in his mailbox. These weren't official complaints, but rather handwritten notes, signed by anonymous neighbors. They were passive-aggressive and dripping with the same snarky tone that Karen had adopted in her earlier confrontation. "The smell from your farm is making our property values plummet," one letter read. "Please be considerate of your neighbors." Another one advised him to fence off your livestock from public view and warned him to mow the fields or expect further action. Jake was starting to be impressed, not by the complaints themselves, but by the sheer pettiness of it all. He couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. He had no intention of complying with these ridiculous demands. His farm was his business, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially not some HOA president, tell him how to run it. Then one afternoon, things took a turn for the worse. Jake was working on his old wooden fence when he heard the unmistakable sound of a chainsaw roaring to life. At first, he thought it was just another neighbor doing yard work, but then he noticed something strange. The noise wasn't coming from his side of the property line. It was coming from the direction of Crestwood Estates. Curious and suspicious, Jake set down his tools and walked over to investigate. What he saw made his blood boil. A group of workers was constructing a fence along the boundary of Jake's property. Not just any fence, mind you, but a high steel gray structure designed specifically to block the view of his farm. The workers had already begun cutting through a section of his property line. And who was supervising this blatant violation? Karen. Jake's jaw tightened as he stormed over to the workers. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice low and seething with fury. Karen turned around, a smug look on her face. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell, we're just implementing some community improvements," she said, her tone sweet and condescending. "This new privacy fence will help protect the visual harmony of Crestwood Estates." Jake pointed toward the workers who had the decency to look uncomfortable. "This is my land. You have no right to put a fence up here." Karen didn't flinch. "Well, that's debatable," she said smoothly. "You see, the community has reviewed older survey maps, and we believe the original property lines were drawn incorrectly. Since your farm borders our neighborhood, it's in everyone's best interest to adjust accordingly." Jake's hands curled into fists, his temper rising. "You believe the property lines were incorrect? You're trying to steal my land." Karen's smile remained. "Until we receive further clarification, we're proceeding with this project. It's for the good of the community." Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His anger was boiling, but he kept his voice calm. "You don't have a permit for this," he said, locking eyes with the workers. One of them hesitated, looking guilty. The HOA told us they had all the legal permissions." Jake smirked, his eyes narrowing. "They don't. And if you don't pack up and leave in the next 5 minutes, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing." The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them shut off the chainsaw. Reluctantly, they began to gather their tools and pack up, clearly unwilling to face the legal trouble they'd be in for following Karen's orders. Karen, however, was livid. "You can't just order them to leave," she snapped. Jake pulled out his phone and started dialing the sheriff's number. "I'm making it official," he said. "Let's get the county involved and sort this out once and for all." Karen paled, realizing she had no ground to stand on. With a huff, she gestured for the workers to leave. As they packed up, Jake stood tall, watching the whole scene unfold. The fence project was dead before it had even begun. But he knew this wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. And so, the battle between Jake Mitchell and Karen Whitmore had only just begun. The days following the fence incident passed in a tense silence, but Jake knew better than to believe the fight was over. Karen had never been the type to back down easily, and though she had temporarily retreated, it was clear that she was preparing for the next move. Jake, however, wasn't the kind to let a threat fester. He knew that a battle with Karen would be long, drawn out, and relentless, but he was ready for it. The first sign that things were about to escalate came with another letter. This one official-looking, with the HOA's logo stamped at the top. It was far more threatening than the last one. Jake opened it, his eyes scanning the carefully worded threats. This letter wasn't just about the farm's aesthetics or the rooster's early morning calls. No, this time it was more serious. The HOA was citing several zoning violations, claiming that his farm's livestock and operations were out of compliance with county regulations. There were mentions of excessive noise, unsanitary conditions, and a laundry list of other complaints, each one more ridiculous than the last. The letter demanded that Jake take immediate action or face legal consequences. Jake let out a long, exasperated sigh as he read through the letter. He wasn't worried. He knew his farm was completely compliant with zoning laws, but the sheer persistence of Karen's harassment was starting to wear on him. He had no intention of being intimidated by her, but he couldn't ignore the fact that she was using her position to manipulate others and waste public resources. The next morning, Jake made a call to his attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who had helped him with various farm-related legal matters over the years. He explained the situation, detailing the recent letter and the ongoing harassment from Karen and the HOA. Sarah listened patiently before responding with a voice that was steady but tinged with concern. "Jake, you've got a case here. They have no jurisdiction over your farm, and everything they've claimed is either fabricated or irrelevant. But that's not the issue. The issue is how far Karen's willing to go. She won't back down easily." Jake grunted in agreement. "I figured as much, but I'm not backing down either. I need this to end, and I need it to end fast." "All right," Sarah said. "Let's make sure we have everything in order, and I'll draft a cease and desist letter. If they keep pushing, we'll take legal action. But first, we'll send them a strong message." Jake didn't hesitate. He got to work right away, gathering all the necessary paperwork. His farm's zoning permits, property deeds and inspection reports, anything that could prove that Karen and the HOA had no legal claim over his land. He knew the law was on his side, but he also knew that Karen's next move would be aggressive. A few days later, the cease and desist letter was ready. Sarah had crafted it with care, detailing all of the HOA's illegal activities and demanding that they stop harassing Jake. She included the warning that if they continued with their efforts, they would be met with a lawsuit for harassment and defamation. Jake signed the letter, feeling a sense of resolve that he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to let Karen control his life. With a deep breath, he sealed the envelope and sent it off to the HOA's office. A small but defiant step toward reclaiming his peace. But Karen wasn't going to take this lying down. A week later, Jake received an unexpected visitor. One of the HOA board members, a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses, showed up at his farm unannounced. He looked uncomfortable, as if he'd been sent on a mission he wasn't quite sure how to complete. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out of the barn to meet him. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone friendly but wary. The board member hesitated before speaking. Mr. Mitchell, I'm here to deliver a message from the HOA. We've received your cease and desist letter. Jake crossed his arms. And? The man shifted his weight uncomfortably. Well, we're not backing down. Karen has made it clear that she wants you to comply with the HOA's regulations. If you don't, we'll take this further. We're already in talks with the county about some of the complaints we've filed. Jake's amusement faded slightly. He knew the HOA had no legal grounds to dictate anything on his property, but the idea that they were involving the county again was more than just an annoyance. It was a sign that Karen wasn't done. Let me get this straight, Jake said slowly, his voice steady. You're here to tell me that the HOA, which I don't even belong to, is trying to make me comply with their rules and regulations based on complaints that have no legal foundation? The board member nodded awkwardly. Yes, Karen believes it's in the best interest of the community. Jake let out a short laugh. The best interest of the community? You mean Karen's vision of what the community should look like, right? The board member didn't respond. He simply handed Jake another document, a legal notice threatening further action if Jake didn't comply. Jake stared at the notice, his irritation simmering beneath the surface. Tell Karen and the rest of the HOA board something for me, he said, his voice low and controlled. If anyone steps foot on my property again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing. Consider this your final warning. The board member, looking defeated, turned and left without another word. Jake stood there for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't going to let this go on any longer. Karen had pushed him too far, and now he was ready to fight back. That evening, Jake made a call to his old friend, Sheriff Tom Caldwell, who had known Jake's family for years. He explained the situation, telling Tom about the recent harassment and the threats from the HOA. Tom listened carefully, and when Jake finished, the sheriff responded with a chuckle. Jake, you've been more than patient. I'll make sure Karen and her board get the message. If they keep this up, we'll put a stop to it. Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. With Tom on his side, he knew that Karen wouldn't be able to get away with her tactics for much longer. But as the days passed, he realized that this battle was far from over. Karen Whitmore had declared war, and Jake wasn't going to just sit back and let her win. He was ready to make sure that Karen regretted every move she made. For the next few weeks, the tension between Jake and Karen escalated to new heights. Karen, never one to back down easily, had upped the ante with every passing day. Jake's resolve only grew stronger as he realized he wasn't dealing with a typical neighborly disagreement anymore. This was a full-blown war, and Jake wasn't just defending his land, he was fighting for his right to live peacefully. The first sign that things had reached a boiling point came one morning when Jake found another letter in his mailbox. He almost didn't need to open it. The HOA's familiar logo, bold and demanding, was already enough to tell him that Karen had found yet another way to stir the pot. Jake opened the letter, scanning the contents. This time, the HOA had upped their game. They had hired a lawyer. The letter demanded that Jake pay a fine for violating various neighborhood standards and regulations, even though his farm wasn't even a part of the HOA's jurisdiction. They cited unapproved exterior colors, noise pollution from the roosters, and even his choice of livestock. The letter threatened immediate legal action if he didn't pay the fine and comply with their request within 10 days. Jake crumpled the letter in his hand and tossed it into the trash. He had already expected this. Karen was relentless, and now she was bringing out the big guns. But he wasn't scared. In fact, the more she pushed, the more determined he became to stand his ground. This time, Jake was going to fight fire with fire. The following morning, Jake made another call to his lawyer, Sarah. He recounted the latest developments, explaining that the HOA was threatening him with legal action. Sarah listened intently before speaking in her calm, professional manner. Jake, we've been through this before. They can't do anything. You're on solid ground legally and they know it. But if they're going to escalate, so are we. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I'll file a response on your behalf. We'll remind them that they have no jurisdiction over your property and will threaten legal action of our own for harassment and defamation. We'll make it clear that they're wasting everyone's time and money. Jake leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sounds good, Sarah. Let's make sure they know we're not backing down. A few days later, Jake received the response from his lawyer. The letter was sharp, concise, and full of legal language that left no room for doubt. It reiterated that the HOA had no legal standing on his property and warned them of potential counteraction should they continue their harassment. He sent the letter off, and with it, his final warning. If the HOA continued to interfere with his farm, it would cost them much more than they were prepared to lose. But Karen wasn't one to back down, and she proved it when she showed up at Jake's farm yet again. Jake had just finished his morning chores when he noticed her car pulling up at the end of his long driveway. He sighed, his patience wearing thin. This time she wasn't alone. She had brought two board members with her, one of them the same wiry man who had delivered her last threat, and a man Jake didn't recognize. He was tall, wearing a suit and looking official, clipboard in hand. Jake was fuming, but he kept his expression neutral as he walked toward them. He wasn't going to let Karen see that she had the upper hand. "Mr. Mitchell," Karen greeted him with that overly sweet tone she always used when she thought she was in control. "I hope you've had a chance to review our letter. We're here to discuss the next steps." Jake didn't bother to hide his irritation. "I've read your letter, Karen, and I've had it reviewed by my attorney. You're wasting your time." The man in the suit stepped forward, his demeanor stiff. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm afraid we have no choice but to take legal action if you refuse to comply. The HOA has consulted with experts, and they have concluded that your farm is in violation of several zoning laws. If you don't take immediate action, we will be forced to file a lawsuit." Jake's jaw clenched. He was sick of this. He had heard enough empty threats. "I've had enough of your games, Karen," Jake said firmly, stepping closer. "You and your HOA have no authority over me. My farm is in full compliance with every law, and you know it. I've already told you, if anyone from your HOA steps foot on my land again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing." Karen's eyes narrowed, but she held her ground. "You're making this far more difficult than it needs to be, Mr. Mitchell." Jake stood tall, unyielding. "No, Karen, you are. You're the one who keeps pushing when you know you've got no legal right to do so." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but one of the board members, her ever-loyal lackey, stepped in. "Maybe we should just let this go. The county's already been involved and they're not taking any action. We don't want to escalate things further." Jake turned to him, surprised by the sudden change in tone. He wasn't used to seeing Karen's supporters back down. "I thought you were here to tell me I was in violation of something." The man shrugged awkwardly. "Maybe this isn't worth pursuing anymore. It's clear we're not getting anywhere." Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph, but he didn't show it. He turned back to Karen, his eyes fixed on hers. "Maybe you should take the hint, Karen." "This is over." Karen's face flushed a deep red. She was seething with anger, but Jake had won the battle. For now. Karen stormed off without another word, her board members trailing behind her. Jake stood there for a moment, feeling a strange mix of relief and triumph. But he knew this wasn't the end. It might have been a small victory, but Karen was relentless. She wasn't going to give up that easily. Jake returned to his chores, but something had shifted. He wasn't just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting for his way of life. And with every confrontation, every legal battle, he was gaining more confidence. Karen had made a mistake when she underestimated him. And as far as Jake was concerned, it was a mistake she was going to regret. But as he worked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. And when she came back, he'd be ready. Jake had learned a lot about the tenacity of people over the years. He had seen the worst in stubborn animals and the best in the hardworking men and women who tended their land, but nothing prepared him for Karen's next move. After their last confrontation, he had hoped she would retreat into the quiet, controlled world of the HOA, nursing her bruised ego. Unfortunately, Karen wasn't the type to let a small defeat stand in her way. If anything, it made her more dangerous. It started with a sign. One morning, Jake woke up to find a massive, shiny for sale sign placed directly at the edge of his property. He squinted from his porch, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and saw that it wasn't just any sign. It was a for sale sign with an additional one beneath it that read, "Under negotiation. Coming soon to Crestwood Estates." Jake's stomach turned. He knew exactly what this was. This wasn't just some real estate blunder. No, this was Karen trying to take his farm, or at least force him out with enough pressure to make him sell. The sign stood there mocking him, publicly advertising his property as if it were already on the market, as if his farm had been sold to Crestwood Estates. Fury washed over him. He stormed down to the road, ripping the sign out of the ground with a force that surprised even him. He tossed it aside like a scrap of trash and stormed back up the driveway, fists clenched at his sides. Before he could even gather himself enough to make the call, he saw Karen's car at the end of his driveway, pulling up with that same smug expression on her face. This time she didn't come alone. She was flanked by two board members, and the man in the suit, the same lawyer who had visited earlier, was with them. His heart sank as he recognized the same condescending look they all wore, as if they had just claimed victory. Jake met them at the gate with a tight expression. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, pointing toward the discarded sign. Karen smiled sweetly, as if she hadn't just violated his property. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice dripping with false kindness. "It seems there's been a bit of confusion. I'm sure you're aware of the negotiations happening within Crestwood Estates, and the real estate agents were just a little premature in placing the sign." Jake could barely contain his anger. "Premature? Karen, this isn't just a mistake. This is you trying to force me out. You're claiming my property is for sale when it's not, and you're doing it all behind my back." Karen crossed her arms, clearly unfazed. "It's all part of a larger community effort, Jake. We're looking to expand the neighborhood. The development would bring benefits to everyone." Jake could hardly believe the audacity. He clenched his fists, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "This is my farm, Karen. My land. You've got no right to claim it, to sell it, or to force me out." The lawyer stepped forward, his clipboard in hand. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice cold and detached, "this sign was placed by the real estate agents working on behalf of Crestwood Estates. There's been some talk of acquiring nearby properties for the expansion. We're simply exploring our options. There's no need to escalate this." Jake didn't even blink. "You don't get to explore your options on my property. You don't own it, and you don't get to put a sign on it without my permission. I'll be calling the sheriff to report this as trespassing, and you can explain to him why you've been interfering with my land." The lawyer stiffened, clearly taken aback. Karen's eyes flickered with irritation, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're making this far more difficult than it needs to be, Mr. Mitchell. We were only trying to be helpful." "Helpful?" Jake sneered. "You're trying to take my farm, Karen, and you know it. I'm done with this. I'm calling the sheriff right now." Karen's expression tightened, her jaw clenching. "You don't need to make threats, Mr. Mitchell. I suggest you reconsider. If you want to escalate this further, I'm more than prepared to take legal action." Jake didn't flinch. "Go ahead. But if you don't remove that sign and leave my property right now, I will make sure you regret it." The lawyer glanced at Karen, and it was clear that the group was beginning to realize they had overstepped. Reluctantly, the real estate agents packed up their things, and with a few terse words, Karen and her board members climbed back into their cars and drove off, their faces flushed with defeat. Jake stood there, watching them go, his blood still simmering. He wasn't done with this fight, not by a long shot. He needed to take action, and fast. He couldn't let them get away with this. By the time the sheriff arrived, Jake had already gathered the necessary documentation: the land deeds, the county's zoning regulations, and a copy of the cease and desist letter he had previously sent to the HOA. Sheriff Tom Caldwell arrived on the scene within an hour, a familiar presence that brought Jake a sense of relief. Tom stepped out of his cruiser, shaking his head. "Jake, I don't know how she thinks she can get away with this. You've got your land rights, and Karen knows it." "I'm done letting her push me around," Jake said, his voice firm. "She thinks she can get away with anything because she's got that HOA behind her. But I'm going to make sure she knows she can't just walk all over me." The sheriff nodded. "Well, you've got the law on your side. Let's get this sorted out." With Tom by his side, Jake called the real estate agents in the HOA office, making it clear that the sign was to be removed immediately. He also made it clear that if anything like this happened again, he would pursue charges for trespassing, harassment, and even fraud if necessary. Tom made sure they understood the seriousness of the situation. By the time the sun started to set, the sign was gone, and Jake had the peace of knowing that the people who had tried to steal his land were finally backing off. But he wasn't naive enough to think this was over. He knew that Karen wouldn't give up that easily. In fact, it was more likely that she'd find some new way to escalate things. Jake wasn't going to wait for that day to come. He had a plan, and he wasn't about to let her get away with it anymore. It was time for him to go on the offensive. The next morning, Jake drove down to the county records office, pulling out all the stops. He requested copies of every document related to his land, zoning permits, land use approvals, anything that would ensure he had the legal right to do whatever he wanted with his property. He knew that Karen would dig into every detail, looking for a way to bring him down, so he was going to be ready. And then Jake had an idea. If Karen wanted a fight, he would give her one. But this time, he wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to make her regret every move she made. A few weeks later, the first of Jake's new plans went into motion. He began advertising the Mitchell Farms annual Fall Festival to the local community. The event would feature live music, local produce, animal demonstrations, and a host of family-friendly activities. He even went all out with a new series of signs, some cheeky, some humorous, each one reminding Crestwood Estates residents that Mitchell Farms was thriving, HOA-free, and proud of it. The real kicker? Jake made sure the event was scheduled for the same weekend that Karen had been planning a community improvement meeting. As the flyers went up and the event drew closer, Jake couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction. He wasn't just fighting for his farm, he was showing Karen exactly what it meant to mess with someone who wasn't afraid to stand his ground. The stage was set, the gloves were off, and Jake was ready for whatever Karen threw at him next. The buzz about Jake Mitchell's annual Fall Festival began to ripple through the town like wildfire. Flyers were pinned to local bulletin boards, posted on social media, and handed out at the farmers market. For the first time in a long time, the farm was alive with the sound of preparation. An event that would showcase not only the best of Jake's farm, but also a direct challenge to Karen Whitmore and her relentless pursuit of control. Jake had decided that this festival would be more than just a celebration of local produce and community spirit. It would serve as a statement, a declaration that Mitchell Farms was not just surviving, but thriving, and that no HOA, no matter how powerful it thought it was, could force him out. And if Karen thought her HOA rules would intimidate him, she was in for a surprise. The days leading up to the festival were a blur of activity. Jake, with the help of a few friends and local volunteers, set up tents for food vendors, arranged hay bales for seating, and built makeshift stages for local musicians. He also organized animal demonstrations, goat milking contests, chicken chasing races, and an educational booth about sustainable farming. It was designed to be fun, family-friendly, and filled with the kind of down-home charm that made people proud to support their local farms. But Jake wasn't just planning a simple festival. He had one final touch in mind, a massive banner that hung prominently across the entrance to the festival grounds. It read, "Mitchell Farms, HOA-free since 1923. Bold, defiant, perfect." As the festival day drew closer, word spread fast. People from all around the town, some from Crestwood Estates, some from neighboring areas, started calling to RSVP. The excitement was palpable. The townspeople were tired of the constant meddling from Karen and her HOA, and this was their chance to show their support for Jake and his farm. And then came the ultimate test, Karen. Jake had been waiting for her to make her move, and as the event date grew nearer, he knew she wouldn't just let it go. If she had been annoyed by the rooster crowing, the sunflowers, and the little legal battles, this was going to send her over the edge. But what Jake didn't expect was the speed at which she would respond. The morning of the festival, just hours before the event was set to begin, Karen's car pulled up at the edge of the property. Jake was inside the barn, making the final preparations, when he saw her strutting up the dirt path toward him. She was alone this time. No board members or lawyers accompanying her. Just her, dressed in her usual crisp beige suit, looking like she was ready to deliver a speech at a corporate meeting rather than confront a farmer. Jake stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Didn't think you'd show up," he said, his voice calm but his eyes hard. Figured you'd be too busy with your little HOA meeting. Karen's expression didn't waver. This festival is a direct challenge to everything the HOA stands for, Jake, she said, her voice high and tight. I've already had several complaints from residents about the noise, the crowds, and the sheer audacity of your actions. This event is nothing more than a public spectacle. Jake raised an eyebrow. And I'm sure you've told everyone in Crestwood Estates that I'm ruining the neighborhood again, right? Karen's smile was tight, like a bear trap. This festival goes against everything we've worked for in Crestwood. The peace, the order, the aesthetic harmony. You've turned your farm into a circus, Jake. Jake grinned, crossing his arms. A circus, huh? Well, if it's a circus, it's one that people actually want to attend. We've got food, music, games, and even a few farm animals. It's the kind of thing that brings the community together. Karen's eyes narrowed. You're making a mockery of everything this neighborhood represents. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe you're right. Maybe your neighborhood's idea of peace and harmony is just controlling everything that doesn't fit your picture-perfect little world. Karen's jaw tightened. She was clearly not used to being challenged in this way. You don't understand, Jake. I'm not going to let you turn this into a farce. If you continue with this festival, you'll be facing legal consequences. I'll make sure of it. Jake's smirk deepened. Go ahead. I'm not worried about your threats. We're fully within our rights to have this event, and I've already checked with the county. You've got no leg to stand on, Karen. Karen's face flushed a deep red. I'll give you one more chance to shut this down, she warned, her voice low and venomous. You're making a mistake, Jake. A huge one. Jake shook his head. Not a chance. This farm is mine, Karen. This festival is happening, whether you like it or not. With that, Karen huffed, turning sharply on her heel and storming back to her car. You'll regret this, Jake, she muttered under her breath, slamming the door behind her. Jake stood there watching her retreat, a small but satisfying smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The festival was about to begin, and Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life by underestimating him. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, the festival grounds were bustling with families, children, and even a few curious residents from Crestwood Estates who had come to see what all the fuss was about. The music was lively, the smell of barbecue and fresh pies filled the air, and the animals were a hit with the kids. Even the goats seemed to be putting on a show, chewing on hay and making funny faces as people gathered to watch. Jake stood at the entrance of the festival grounds, surveying the scene with a sense of pride. This was his farm, his land, and despite all the attempts to strip it away from him, it was thriving. The festival was a hit. People were laughing, talking, and enjoying the simple joys of farm life. It was exactly the kind of celebration he had envisioned when he decided to fight back. As the day drew to a close, the local news station showed up, intrigued by the event and the buzz it had generated. Jake gave an impromptu interview, proudly talking about the farm and the importance of supporting local businesses. He even gave the camera a little wink when asked about the banner that hung at the entrance. Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever felt oppressed by Karen and her ilk. Karen didn't show up again that day, and by the time the festival ended, Jake knew without a doubt that she wouldn't be coming back for the final blow. She had been defeated, not by the law, not by paperwork, but by the community, and that, to Jake, was the sweetest victory of all. As the sun set and the last of the festival goers left, Jake stood in the middle of his farm, watching the light fade over the fields. He had fought for his land, for his way of life, and for his right to live peacefully. And in the end, he had won. It was over. The war was over. Jake took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. Peace had finally returned to Mitchell Farms, and this time, it was here to stay. The days following the festival felt like a calm after a storm. The town was still buzzing about the success of Jake's annual fall festival, and word had spread far beyond Crestwood Estates. The once feared HOA president, Karen Whitmore, was no longer a presence in the community, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free from her control. Even some of the residents from Crestwood Estates, The ones who had quietly supported Jake from the shadows came forward to express their admiration for his strength and determination. It wasn't just the victory over Karen that made Jake's heart swell with pride. It was the way the entire community had rallied behind him. What started as a personal fight had turned into a collective stand against a tyrant. And in doing so, Jake had not only defended his farm, but had helped inspire others to stand up for their own rights, their own freedom, and their own values. The following week, Jake was contacted by the local newspaper. They wanted to run a feature on his farm in the festival, highlighting not just the success of the event, but the broader lesson it taught. Jake agreed to the interview, knowing it was a chance to further share his message. The article ran with the headline, "Mitchell Farms, a stand for freedom and community spirit." It told the story of how one man had refused to let a group of entitled individuals control his life and how his stand had inspired others to do the same. The piece praised the festival's success and the way Jake had used his farm to bring people together, showcasing what it truly meant to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were against you. As Jake read the article, he sat back and reflected on the months of tension, the constant threats, and the pressure that had weighed on his shoulders. He had fought tooth and nail for his property, his livelihood, and his way of life. But in the end, it wasn't just about the farm. It was about something much bigger. Standing firm in the face of adversity and never letting anyone take away your right to live life on your own terms. As the weeks turned into months, Karen's name faded from town discussions. Her power had crumbled, and with it, the oppressive hold she had over the community. The HOA board had fallen apart, with several members stepping down or publicly apologizing to Jake for their role in supporting her. The new leadership was more reasonable, and the neighborhood began to heal from the scars of Karen's reign. For Jake, life on the farm had returned to normal, but with a newfound sense of peace. He spent his mornings walking through the fields, watching the sunrise over the horizon, knowing that he had fought for and won his place in this world. The farm was more than just a patch of land. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what was right, and of the power of community. In the months that followed, Jake expanded his farming business. He turned the Fall Festival into an annual event that drew people from all over the region. He worked harder than ever, but now he worked without the looming threat of an overbearing HOA president. The sense of freedom he had earned was sweeter than any success he could have imagined. The lesson from the story: Jake's journey is a powerful reminder that the greatest battles we face often aren't against forces beyond our control, but against those who believe they can impose their will on us. Whether it's a tyrannical HOA president, an unjust system, or anyone who tries to limit our freedoms, the lesson is clear. Never back down in the face of adversity. In the end, it wasn't the legal threats or the official complaints that won the day for Jake. It was his unwavering commitment to standing up for what he believed in. It was his willingness to fight for his right to live freely and peacefully. And in doing so, he not only protected his farm, but inspired an entire community to do the same. The lesson here is simple. Your rights are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem stacked against you. By standing firm and refusing to be intimidated, we can overcome even the most powerful forces. It's not always the loudest voices or the strongest threats that win the battle. It's the quiet confidence of knowing who you are, what you stand for, and never compromising on those values. For Jake, that meant keeping his farm, his home, and his freedom. And in the end, it was a victory not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt like they were being silenced.